Civilization 7 is coming out on PC and consoles on February 11th of 2025, and in addition to getting some information about that, which I just realized I've left on 2x speed behind me. Guys, I don't know about you, I always watch YouTube at 2 times speed, so if you're watching me at 2 times speed, watch that behind me at 2 times speed, then it's 4x speed and probably looks really crazy. But anyway, let's go ahead and pause that, and let's actually talk about the main topic of today's video, which is the PC system requirements. Which actually, when I was looking at the comments here on X, where these were tweeted out on X by the developer, or X'd out on X on the, I don't know how you pronounce that these days. Anyway, the point is, I actually saw some pushback against these system requirements being kind of high, which surprised me as someone who keeps track of system requirements for a variety of games, because compared to most games out there right now, I would say these look extremely reasonable. However, when I was trying to decide, okay, so why are some people upset over these, I then decided to look up the system requirements for the previous game. So when I looked up Civilization 6 PC system requirements, I now think I understand why there's maybe some people upset over this. Because if you've been playing the previous game on the minimum system requirements for that game, which is a bit old at this point, and could run on quite reasonable systems even when it came out, I mean, we're talking like ancient AMD processor, like a Phenom 2, an Intel Core i3, literally says like any generation, but they were talking older generations back then. Only 4 gigabytes of RAM. You could have an AMD 5570. That's like many, many generations ago. NVIDIA 450. Now I see what people are talking about. We're talking recommended system requirements, where the AMD GPUs they're recommending are 7000 series, but not the current 7000 series. We're talking the 7000 series that was so long ago that they're reusing the 7000 series again because it's like outside of reasonable memory of when you wouldn't confuse the generations. So if you're coming from Civilization 6 PC system requirements, I am now understanding why maybe you would be interpreting these as like, whoa, okay, that's asking quite a bit more for my PC. So I do see where people I think are coming from on that. However, if we go ahead and look at what we have here, first of all, the storage space, 20 gigabyte SSD. Now it does mention SSD, it doesn't say hard disk drive. So if you are playing on an older system without an SSD, again, I don't have this to benchmark yet. We're running off the system requirements. They are specifically stating SSD. Now, could it run on a hard disk drive? My guess would be it probably could. Just given the type of game that this is. And I believe we're also getting console launches on like PlayStation 4, aren't we? At least that's what I'm seeing on, Googling it, a PS4 version. If there's a PS4 version and an Xbox One version and things like that, then those have hard drives, not solid state drives. So my thoughts on the SSD requirement would probably be like, you should get an SSD if you can. They make your PC feel a lot faster. But my guess would be it's not actually required. And 20 gigabytes compared to a lot of games nowadays is not asking a massive amount of storage space. They are saying you should be at least on Windows 10 and have DX12 support. Anyway, as far as RAM goes, and notice this is RAM, not VRAM, they're saying 8 gigabytes minimum, 16 recommended, 32 for Ultra. Whether you really need that, I don't know. We'll have to see. But when we're talking about these minimum recommended and Ultra specs, what kinds of frame rates are we talking about? So this isn't one of the most detailed charts like this I've ever seen. It at least is telling us a graphic setting, a resolution, and a frame rate, which I absolutely love to see. Hate when we get system requirements that just say minimum, list some systems, and you're like, okay, does minimum mean 1080p 30 FPS low? Or does it mean 1080p 60 FPS low? Or 720p, So anyway, this is at least specifying resolution and frame rate, and I also do not see any mention of upscaling on this chart. Now that also means I don't know if the game supports upscaling at this time. I tried to do a Google search, see if anything had been announced, and all I got was an article saying that Firaxis Games has not revealed whether or not the game will support NVIDIA DLSS or FSR at this point. They're specifically calling out the frame generation and mentioning that in a turn-based game, where frame generation sometimes has a latency impact and doesn't look great in fast-moving scenes, in a turn-based game, it might actually be a really good fit for frame generation, which is an interesting point. But again, at this point, no confirmation on if any of that will be available. Anyway, so I think actually in a game like this, where a lot of times in a lot of games I'd be more focused on the GPU. In a simulation style game, I think the CPU is definitely also something to think about. Although, in addition to perhaps impacting frame rate, one thing I don't see this mention is turn times. Like, how long does it take for the CPU to calculate, enemy turns? Because I know for me, playing Civ, various civs over the years, I think sometimes that's a more interesting metric maybe than frame rate. Because again, in a turn-based game, I could probably live with the lower frame rate, but do I want to sit there for ages while it calculates the enemy turns? And we don't seem to have any information on that at this point. But anyway, for 30 frames per second, low graphics settings at 1080p, they're mentioning an Intel Core i3-10100 or AMD Ryzen 3 1200. So these are only i3 and Ryzen 3s. So if we actually pull up the specs for those, these are only 4-core processors. The i3-10100 is 4-core 8-thread, and the Ryzen 3 1200 is 4-core 4-thread. So they really are saying you can play this game on a 4-core processor, even a 4-core 4-thread processor like the Ryzen 3 1200, which came out back in 2017. So a low-end chip from 7 years ago should be able to at least get you in the door, maybe not with amazing performance. The Core i3-10100, like I said, is 4-core 8-thread, and this one came out in 2020. So it's a bit newer, but again, was kind of lower end on that side of things. So this is where I'm feeling like we're not asking for that crazy amount. Although again, they are only saying 30 FPS, so if you wanted to play at a higher frame rate, it is possible you will need a higher end CPU, where they step up to the recommended specs, which are medium settings, 60 FPS, 1080p. They're jumping up to an i5-10400. So notice they're still in the 10 series of Intel, but they're jumping from the i3 to the i5. So what's going to be the difference from the i3 to the i5? Well, again, the i3 was 4-core 8-thread, and if we jump up to that i5-10400, we're going up to 6-core 12 threads. So more cores and threads, but from the same generation, indicating the game might run better with more cores. They were also, from the Ryzen side of things, the AMD side of things, going from the lowest end specs at the 4-core 4-thread Ryzen 3 1200 up to the Ryzen 5 3600X, which is 6-core 12-thread. Now, they put the X version on here. The 3600 non-X, if I remember correctly, was a much more common CPU, and there's only a minor clock speed difference between them. It would not really affect your gaming performance in any meaningful way, so if you have the 3600, I think that would be fine. I think in general what they're saying is a 6-core 12-thread CPU from either Intel or AMD from within the last several years. Like this one came out in 2019. This came out 5 years ago. The 10400, again, came out in 2020, so 4 years ago. That's kind of what they're saying for that 60 FPS medium settings kind of experience. Now, if you wanted to jump up to 4K high settings, they're suddenly putting in much beefier CPUs. Now, I want to mention that in most games, going to a higher resolution doesn't put a meaningful increase in the CPU workload. Also, most graphic settings also don't put a meaningful increase on the CPU load, although certain graphic settings do, like ray tracing, for example. But again, I've seen no indication that this game is using ray tracing at those higher specs. So in other words, what I'm saying is, if this is still for 60 frames per second, and so is the recommended specs, I wouldn't be too scared of those big beefy CPUs, because if you can hit 60 FPS with a 10400 or a Ryzen 5 3600, then even if you're playing at 4K resolution, you can probably still hit 60 FPS on those same CPUs. And so unless something crazy in the graphics setting going from medium to high is putting some massive new CPU burden, which, like I said, is very unusual, I would say that these are probably overdone on the CPU side of thing here for the ultra specs. Not to say that you wouldn't necessarily want a higher end CPU for things like I said, like maybe the enemy turn times being quicker and things like that. So maybe they're recommending a high end system could take advantage of a much beefier CPU. And the interesting thing here again is that we're getting a lot more cores. So the 14700F has 20 cores and 28 threads, although a number of those are not P cores. They are E cores, they're efficiency cores, which oftentimes wouldn't be used in gaming workloads, so not 100% sure what to make of that. And the Ryzen 9 5950X actually has 16 performance cores. The AMDs don't differentiate between core types. These are all the same type of cores. 16 cores, 32 threads. The vast majority of games I've ever seen do not scale up to 32 threads. Perhaps a simulation type game could, so maybe this would. Question mark? I don't know. So I'm just saying that's kind of an interesting spec. But in terms of frame rate, like I said, if you can get 60 FPS on these more reasonable CPUs, I have a feeling you're probably not going to be hurting if you're playing on a higher resolution display. Now, let's go ahead and end with the GPU side of thing, where the minimum GPUs are listed as a GTX 1050 for NVIDIA, an RX 460 for AMD, or an Intel Arc A380 for Intel. I do like that they're including Intel GPUs on the chart, which means they are probably considering them in terms of optimization when making the game, which is good, because that's not a given for all developers given Intel's low market share right now. Anyway, so those are good for 1080p lowest settings at 30 frames per second. So they get you in the door. Now, what do those look like, and what if you don't have those, right? So if you go to a site like Tech PowerUp's and use their relative performance chart for their GPU database, you can get a good idea of where your GPU might fall. And also we can look at how these compare between NVIDIA, AMD, and Intel recommendations, because the GTX 1050, first of all, is only a 2 gigabyte GPU, so it doesn't look like VRAM is going to be a massive concern on the lowest settings. And then, again, this came out in 2016, so that's 8 years old at this point. Actually, yeah, in October, so we're just about 8 years old on the GTX 1050. And if we look at the GPUs that they're comparing this against, for the other low settings, the RX 460 is listed as about 87% of the performance of the 1050. Now, this is ballpark figures from Tech PowerUp here, especially the older the GPU is. A lot of times there's been difference in drivers updates and how well they support newer features, and a lot of this would have been based on really old review data, and I'm not sure if these get updated that often or at all for the much older parts here. Like I said, 8 years old on the GTX 1050. So, but it's at least a general ballpark figure of what was normal, when they were reviewed by Tech PowerUp initially. Now, so 87% of the performance, that's not worlds apart. Those are in the same kind of ballpark figure. And again, maybe you're spotting your GPU somewhere in between here. GTX 480, RX 7370, GTX 660, GTX 950, stuff like that. You're in the same kind of world. You're living in a similar ballpark. Interestingly, though, if we scroll up, we have to go quite a ways more powerful to get that Intel GPU, the Arc A380. So if we keep going here, again, you might spot your GPU here somewhere in these lists. There's some popular things here like the 1050 Ti, GTX 960. So if you're on an older system, you might very well have those. The Arc A380 is coming in at 50% more powerful. Now, that could indicate that this game just is not particularly well optimized for Intel, for them to have thrown them that into this similar kind of ballpark, or it's just the fact that Intel Arc GPUs, the A380 is pretty low end, right? So maybe there just isn't a lower end Intel GPU to list, so that could be why they're listing it here. And maybe it will actually perform 50% better than the GTX 1050 and the RX 460. So I wouldn't read too much into that 50% performance difference. Especially because if we jump into, sorry, I clicked out of that. If we jump into the recommended settings for 1080p medium 60 FPS, Our GPUs are now the RTX 2060 for NVIDIA, the RX 6600 for AMD, and the Intel Arc A750 for Intel. And these three GPUs are very similar if we check the relative performance chart. Not identical, some are better than others, but they're within the same realm of general ballpark performance. Also, we can look at how much more performance they're asking to go from the low 30 FPS 1080p to medium 60 FPS 1080p. We would expect to go from 30 FPS to 60 FPS to have a doubling in GPU performance requirement, and then from low settings to medium settings in an additional increase, so potentially more than doubling the GPU performance they're asking for. So if we look at the GTX 1050, set that as 100% baseline and scroll down, and again, maybe you'll spot your GPU somewhere in here, and I'll link this chart in the video description. If we scroll down here, what would be about twice as powerful as a 1050? Something like a GTX 1060. So here, maybe you're at low settings, 60 FPS. So if you're wondering what would it take to get low settings 60 FPS, something like a GTX 1060 if their chart is actually accurate, right? Because it should scale like that. Or a Radeon RX 580 or somewhere along there. If you have a GTX 1660, you're now more than doubling the performance, right? So you're probably into 60 FPS and then some, or maybe turning up some graphics settings. Now, if we keep going, we're finally at the RTX 2060, which is what they listed for 1080p medium 60 FPS. Notice that's actually a little over 3 times the performance of a GTX 1050. But I think that's realistic because, once again, we're doubling the performance to go from 30 to 60, and it would be take double the performance if you didn't increase the graphic settings, just the frame rate. But if we're also increasing the graphic settings from low to medium, we would expect more than double the performance to be required, and that's where we're seeing 3 times the performance to get to that RTX 2060, so I think all of this makes a lot of sense. Now I'm going to set that RTX 2060 as the baseline, and let's look at how those other listed GPUs stack up. So the RX 6600 from AMD is generally more powerful, but not worlds apart. Again, we're seeing 9% in this particular relative performance chart. So not at all worlds apart. Also, the RTX 2060 is just a 6GB GPU, so it's very possible that 6GB cards are completely fine for the medium graphics settings at 1080p. Now, if we look at the Intel Arc A750, it's 20% faster than the 2060, and it's about 10% faster than the RX 6600, depending on the game. Intel performance can kind of vary pretty wildly, but the point is, we're only 20% apart from when we're looking at these GPUs. With them kind of spread around that. So this seems reasonable, right? We're in the same kind of relative performance ballpark. Now, if we go ahead and look at, okay, so I want to play this at 4K, 60 frames per second at high settings, totally maxing out the game on a 4K display. Yes, it's going to ask for significantly more power, but RTX 4070 and RX 7800 XT, I can definitely tell you as somebody who looks at PC system requirements for the latest AAA games, this is generally GPUs that are hitting 1440p high settings 60 FPS in the latest games, and oftentimes to completely max them out, even needing DLSS or FSR quality for 1440p. And generally for 4K, they'd be relying on some pretty heavy-duty upscaling or reducing the graphic settings for the biggest latest AAA games. So I would say, again, that compared to big modern AAA releases, this isn't asking for a crazy amount from the GPU for 4K high settings at 60 FPS, especially if this has no upscaling, which is what's indicated here. So if we look at our relative performance chart again, if I'm going from the 2060 up to an RTX 4070, we're going from 1080p to 4K resolution, which is 4 times the number of pixels, which doesn't always scale linearly with performance demand, though. So often it would be more like doubling the actual workload on the GPU, even though it's 4 times the amount of pixels. But we're also going from medium graphics settings to high graphics settings, which would have some additional demand. So if we scroll up again, maybe you'll spot your GPU in here, and that would allow you to increase settings off of that medium 60 FPS 1080p or increase to a 1440p display, right? So you see a lot of GPUs here. We're scrolling up. We get to the RTX 4070. It's a little more than double the performance. So again, I find that actually reasonable for going from 1080p 60 to 4K 60. especially if we're also increasing graphic settings along the line, right? And if we click on the 4070 now as the baseline and look at the 7800 XT, that's generally within the same ballpark. Again, it's usually a little bit faster if we're not talking about ray tracing, but not worlds apart. Here we're seeing 7% on this particular chart. So again, everything there seems pretty reasonable. So then if you have an even higher end GPU, so, like a 4080, 4090. So if a 4090 is twice as fast as a 4070, then you could be playing at 4K 120 high settings instead of 4K 60 high settings on the 4070, right? Now, I would hope that the game would support DLSS or FSR, especially for 4K resolution. It'd be really nice to use at least quality level upscaling and some stuff. But again, as I said earlier in the video, as far as I can tell, Firaxis has not revealed any of those types of PC feature support. All right, that's what I've got for you guys today. If you appreciate what I do here on the channel, consider hitting the join button and becoming a channel member to directly support the channel financially. Hugely appreciate it, but totally understand that not everybody's in a position to do that. Huge thank you to just viewers, subscribers, commenters, all of you. You're all beautiful people, and I hope you have an excellent day.